In mid-November, Rivals 2 received a big controller update targeted at future-proofing and expanding controller compatibility, as well as adding some features to help players quickly calibrate their controller on a new setup. When the patch first came out, a lot of players reported that their inputs felt off, and to this day aren't quite sure when dropped inputs are their fault or the game's. I realized there aren't any videos really explaining why these things happen, so I wanted to put out a video that could help people more easily understand how inputs work, so they can set more appropriate sensitivities and be more mindful about the muscle memories they train on split-second inputs. I'm Birdguy, let's get into it. Before we get into specifics, let's start from the beginning by explaining broad concepts. It's a gross simplification of everything going on under the hood, but I'm focusing on explaining it in a way that is as simple as possible while still making sense and covering all of our bases. The stick on your controller is a two-dimensional pointer at the center of 4 quadrants ranging from -1 to 1 on both axes. At rest, your stick is pointing to 0, 0. When you move the stick right or left, its X value increases or decreases between 1 and -1. When you move it up or down, its Y value increases or decreases between 1 and -1. Visually, we can combine the X and Y values to point at a specific location on a two-dimensional graph that is restricted to your controller's gate. Most modern controllers use a circular gate, and GameCube controllers use an octagonal gate. By default, Rivals 2 takes those X and Y values and translates them just a little bit to determine what your character should be doing. We'll be going over those translations later. We can see the resulting value by turning on input display or by entering training mode and going into the frame-by-frame mode. The X and Y values are used to determine how you'll move, and when you press a button, it will use those X and Y values to determine what action will be done. We can visualize that input criteria as zones on a graph laid over our left stick. We have some varying control over the size of the zones, but for now, we'll be talking about their default values. It's also important to keep in mind that these zones are just a visualization of a set of input conditions that change out depending on what state we're in, such as standing or airborne, and that X and Y values aren't always considered at the same time. By this, I mean that X and Y controller input values are independent of each other. For instance, when standing still, holding straight up on the stick to set our Y value to 1 does nothing, but if we continue to push the stick to the right towards the diagonal, the character will begin to walk right because the X value is increasing. The X value is unaffected by the Y value, which will be important later and also for the first zone we cover. This first zone, which is universal among every state, is this built-in central dead zone. While in this zone, the stick is considered at rest or in neutral position. Even if you push the stick just a little bit to register an X value, your character won't move, and the value won't have any influence over your button presses or angle checks. Remember that while we have visualized this as a square zone for clarity's sake, the way it functions is more like this. X inputs between the 2 red bars don't do anything, Y inputs between the 2 blue bars don't do anything, and any input that falls within the purple square doesn't do anything. For Rivals 2, a 0.2 by 1 input is no different from a 0 by 1 input. But a 0.29 by 1 input can do something completely different. When I say past the center dead zone for an axis, just understand that I'm referring to an input greater than 0.29. All actions that result in you turning around are looking for a reverse input past the center dead zone, rather than a reverse input past 0. This means that in order to get a turnaround up special, your X value needs to be at least 0.29 in the opposite direction. The next zone we'll want to talk about is the zone that disables our ledge grab hitbox when we're airborne, which starts at Y is less than or equal to -0.8. While in the air, any frame where our Y input is read to be lower than -0.8, our ledge grab hitbox will be disabled. By going above -0.8, the ledge grab hitbox immediately re-enables itself. As I mentioned before, zones are typically only referencing a single axis value, and in this case it only references the Y value. This means no matter where your X input is, as long as Y is less than -0.8, the ledge grab hitbox is disabled. When standing, the bottom of our stick has a different zone, starting at Y is less than or equal to -0.6. Whether you're standing on solid ground or on a platform, if you are not in a committed state like dash or shield, you'll enter the crouch state when you move the stick into this zone, and exit it when you return to Y is greater than -0.6. The next zone is one we can actually change pretty freely, known officially as the hard press threshold, and by default is at 80%, or any X or Y input that exceeds negative or positive 0.8. A hard press can be buffered and is registered when you pass the center dead zone and enter the hard press threshold within 4 frames, and is required to start a dash on the ground, start a fastfall in the air, plat drop while standing, roll or spot dodge and shield, or perform a strong attack with tap strong. This means that if you pass the center dead zone on an axis and don't enter the hard press threshold within those 4 frames, or you buffer the hard press too early, you will be locked out of those actions until you re-enter the center dead zone or pass it in the other direction. Of course, if you're trying to crouch on a platform, this might be the desired outcome, and might seem difficult to do when, at least for 4 frames, you must keep your Y value between -0.6 and -0.8 to crouch or risk plat dropping. While in shield, the hard press threshold is instead used for rolling and spot dodging, but is clamped out when holding both shield buttons or the walk mod button. While in shield, the entire bottom half of your stick past the center dead zone is a zone dedicated to plat dropping and even has priority over the hard press threshold. This technique is known as shield dropping and is why people will go into shield when they're trying to drop through a platform. When you press the special button, you use a special based on which of these zones your stick is pointing at when the button was pressed. When we press the special button, first it checks if Y is greater than 0.425 or Y is less than -0.425. If it is, then it performs an up or down special, and it turns around if the X value is past the center dead zone or in the opposite direction. If it doesn't pass that check, then it checks if X is greater than 0.6 or if X is less than -0.6. If it is, it performs a forward special in that direction. If it doesn't pass that check, then it performs a neutral special, and it turns it around if X passes the center dead zone in the opposite direction. Turnaround neutral specials can also be done much easier in the air with air parry by default or air grab, and only requires that the stick is past the center dead zone in the opposite direction. Tilts are much simpler and don't really use zones. Either you do a jab when you're in the center dead zone, or you do a tilt based on which X or Y value is greater, same for strong attacks. There are some exceptions to this, like when you are doing tilt boosting, but we're not going to get into that today. Before we even get into talking about adjusting our sensitivities, let's go over the very first reason most people try to change them. You keep accidentally dashing when you're just trying to use a forward tilt. You keep accidentally spot dodging when you're trying to fall through the platform you're standing on. Well, this is why I've drawn up these zone diagrams. We can visualize what areas we can move the stick to get the outcome we want. Let's say all we want to do is walk forward and use a forward tilt. We can't press the stick too fast and too far or else we'll get a dash attack. We have to get an X value between 0.29 and 0.8, which becomes way easier to hit if we aim for a diagonal on the edge of our stick, rather than a floating point somewhere in the middle. With our right stick set to attack, we just flick the stick to the right and don't have to worry about accidentally getting an up tilt instead. Well, I'm sure some folks have already realized the first elephant in the room that I haven't been addressing, and that's that our controllers don't use square gates. With a circular gate, the area we can hit on this visual actually looks a bit more like this. Well, that's still not too bad, right? All you have to do is hit that highlighted edge to get exactly what you want, except it looks a little tougher for some actions than others. You might start to feel the squeeze of demanding diagonals when it comes to doing specials. It's by no means bad, but when the controller update dropped, these diagonals changed for most players without them even realizing it. When the game first released, left stick sensitivity was set to 120% by default. Now it's 100% by default. So what does left stick sensitivity do exactly? Remember how I said Rivals 2 takes your left stick's coordinates and translates them? The first thing it does is lay a graph on top of your stick, and by default, that graph is a one-to-one translation of your stick at 100% sensitivity. But changing the stick sensitivity changes the size of the graph that Rivals 2 lays over your stick compared to your stick. At 50% sensitivity, the graph doubles in size, meaning moving 0.1 units on your stick only moves 0.05 units in Rivals 2. At 200% sensitivity, the graph is half its original size, meaning moving 0.1 units on your stick moves 0.2 units in Rivals 2. This means you can go beyond a 1.0 coordinate value all the way up to 3.0, but after translation, Rivals 2 will bump any number over 1 back down to 1. And it does this independently of both coordinates. By this, I mean if you reach a 1.2 by 1 input, it will be translated to a 1 by 1 input. The value that didn't pass the 1.0 threshold will not be affected. If you're using a controller that can't naturally reach a 1.0 value in a direction, you can bump up your sensitivity to reach that number. Keep in mind that Rivals 2 does expect us to be able to hit 1.0 values, as you must input x equals -1 or 1 to reach your maximum walk, run, and air drift speeds. So there are very few situations where anyone would want to set their sensitivity lower than 100%. While having our sensitivity at 100% does make it easier to hit small specific zones like the turnaround neutral special, we can increase our sensitivity back to 120% to hit inputs that 100% sensitivities can't hit, such as -0.8.8. In other words, it makes hitting diagonals slightly easier. As we increase sensitivity, the zones that don't border a corner get harder to hit, especially zones on the inside that don't border an edge at all. Remember that the zones are just a visual defined by input criteria. The zones on the outer edges of our input graph do not have an upper limit in their criteria and therefore continue to stretch on to infinity. So the smaller the graph, the more of our stick these edge zones take up. When adjusting sensitivity, this should be the main question you consider. Am I having more trouble hitting diagonals or hitting inside zones? You can adjust your sensitivity between 100% and 120% to see what feels best for you. Try to aim for turnaround up specials and turnaround neutral specials. Turnaround up specials become easier to hit at higher sensitivity, and turnaround neutral specials are easier to hit at lower sensitivity. A common misconception is to lower stick sensitivity if you struggle with walking and tilting versus dash attacking. But while that does make it harder to hit the hard press threshold, you're also shaving off max movement speed if you go under 100%. Even at 100%, you might lose drift speed when you go under an x equals 1 input to hit a diagonal. In fact, increasing left stick sensitivity can actually make it easier to walk. By setting our sensitivity to 120% and our hard press threshold to 95%, we have effectively kept the hard press threshold the same size on the stick while shrinking the center dead zone, giving us more walking space. Changing settings like this might not be ideal for every controller, but it's the sort of considerations you can make when you understand the systems at play. When adjusting your hard press threshold, just keep in mind that its percent value is the translated input that Rivals 2 is expecting for a hard press. Even at 300% stick sensitivity, an 80% hard press threshold is only a 0.8 value out of a possible 3.0. A lower hard press threshold means you reach the threshold sooner, at its lowest 50% setting, at a 0.5 input value. This means it takes up more of your diagonal space and is quicker to get to from the center dead zone. A lower threshold can make faster dash dancing, baby dashing, and moonwalking much easier to do. Setting it lower than 80% has the added benefit of detaching it from the disable ledge grab hitbox zone that starts at y is less than -0.8. You can fast fall from the stage after a wave dash and grab the ledge without resetting to neutral, which can make hex dashing a lot easier. On the other end, increasing the threshold can make it easier to walk, shield DI, and do down inputs in the air without fast falling. While learning diagonals will help with accidental hard press inputs, it doesn't hurt to tailor the threshold to your preference, and I mostly recommend setting it no higher than a value that would inhibit your ability to dash dance. There's one more elephant in the room that I haven't addressed, and that's the final translation that Rivals 2 does to your stick coordinates before using it for input. The left stick dead zone. Different from the center dead zone, which is just ignoring inputs under 0.29 in both directions, the left stick dead zone takes values under a certain threshold from your stick itself and snaps them to 0 before they're even read by the game. The higher the dead zone setting, the higher that threshold is. The default setting is 20%, and it ranges from 5% all the way up to 85%. At 20%, it snaps any input from your controller below 0.2 to 0, and treats 0.2 as 0.001. At 100% stick sensitivity, you'll still be able to reach a 1.0 input, but it scales slightly differently, essentially squashing the quadrants away from the center and making some diagonal inputs out of range. Any stick position in the orange area and outside of the grid has its Y position snapped to 0. Any stick position in the pink area and outside of the grid has its X position snapped to 0. Any stick position where the two axes cross outside of the grid is read as true 0 by 0. It starts to look like a big D-pad, doesn't it? Making the left stick dead zone bigger makes the orange and pink zones wider, and makes more stick inputs snap to 0. And when stacked with the built-in center dead zone, it can make for a really large effective dead zone. If your controller experiences bad snapback, you can increase this setting to help alleviate it. If you have a hard time horizontally wave dashing, this can also help line them up and keep them straight, especially if you're doing it back and forth. Since increasing this setting does squash the quadrants, it does make hitting diagonals more deliberate, which can help if you ever find yourself doing them on accident, while increasing the overall size of neutral inputs for neutral special and jab. It makes any zone that overlaps with an axis much easier to hit on that axis since it stretches across the axis. If you accidentally up special when trying to side special, you can increase this setting to increase the side special's presence on the Y-axis. It's also useful as a secondary way to squash zones like the disable ledge grab hitbox down just a bit, since it makes it a relatively smaller area on the stick itself. I can't imagine this would be especially useful for anyone, but a funny outcome from setting our dead zone to the max value of 85% is that the dead zone becomes so wide in both directions that our diagonals actually read as 0 by 0 inputs. With a fuller understanding of how Rivals 2 reads your inputs, you should now be much more comfortable adjusting your settings in a way that feels more natural to you. As you test each setting, consider the difficulty of dash dancing, shield dropping, turnaround specials, and horizontal wave dashing. Make sure you're able to reach 1.0 input values and that you can hit diagonals such as 1 by 0.5 for full drift up specials. Before we go, I wanted to cover some changes from the latest patch that came out during this video's production that assists with the two major pain points involved with stick sensitivity. The addition of the suppressed dash attack and the roll stick options. These two options can be found in advanced settings, and I have an entire video that goes over them and the other options added that patch that I'll link in the description. Specifically for controller sensitivities, you'll need to understand that suppressed dash attack gives you a lesser of two evils result. That's closer to the expected result, but not quite the same. While the option is great to turn on to ensure you don't accidentally misinput a highly committal and undesired dash attack, learning to walk, or baby dash for that matter, is still the best way to move forward and get the tilt you want since the initial dash state is still a mostly committal state. You'll see the difference especially on characters with longer initial dash states. As for stick roll options, if you set rolling to the right stick only, your left stick's zones and shield changes from this to this. You can dedicate your entire left stick and shield to shield DI and shield dropping, and the only drawback is learning to roll and spot dodge exclusively with the right stick. Thank you so much for sticking around until the end of the video. If you found this video helpful and would like more content like this, please leave a like, subscribe, and comment. I'd especially love to hear what everyone's sensitivity preferences end up being after applying what we learned from making and watching this video. Thanks to the incredible support of you, the Rivals community, we're now super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers. I'd also like to thank the awesome Serene Mango who created the stick sensitivity app for this video featured throughout. A link to download the app to try it yourself will be in the description below. Finally, I'd like to thank Aether Studios for the opportunities provided to creators like me. And the absolute best way you can support us creators is to continue supporting Aether Studios. The latest wrestling bundles have been my absolute favorite so far, and it'd mean a lot to me if you grabbed any bundle for yourself to support the continued development of my favorite game. You can tell Aether Studios I sent you by pressing Start in the shop menu, selecting Support a Creator, and entering the code Birdguy. Even if you've used my code before, you'll want to go in and set it again because it expires every 2 weeks to keep me on top of my game. Anytime you make a real money purchase for the next 2 weeks, you and I get to split a 10% kickback down the middle, which is how Aether Studios pays creators to promote their game. I guess that means I should get to work on my next video, and until then, I'll scrawl you later.